Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history, where the line between survival and savagery becomes terrifyingly blurred. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you listening to this late at night, alone in your room, perhaps during a quiet morning commute, or maybe in the comfort of your home, surrounded by family? Drop a comment below telling us where you are and what time it is. Your presence in our haunted community matters, and knowing we are all exploring these shadows together makes the experience more profound. This is a story that has been buried for over a century, hidden in the dusty archives of Virginia County records, whispered about in the isolated communities of the Appalachian Mountains, but never fully told, until now. The year was 1879. The place was Grayson County, Virginia, deep in the heart of Appalachia, where winter could turn entire settlements into frozen prisons, cut off from the outside world for months at a time. It was in this unforgiving landscape that the Watson family made their home on a modest farm nestled between ancient oak trees and rolling hills that seemed to stretch into eternity. David Watson, 42 years old, was known throughout the region as a hard-working, God-fearing man who had built his farm from nothing. His wife, Rose, 38, was beloved by neighbors for her kindness and her remarkable cooking, particularly her meat pies that she would share during the rare community gatherings. They had 3 children whose laughter once echoed through the valleys surrounding their property. In the autumn of 1879, as the first frost began to settle on the Virginia mountains, David made a decision that would seal his family's fate. He hired a farmhand. The man's name was Ezra Coulter, a drifter who had appeared in town seemingly out of nowhere, asking for work and shelter through the coming winter. At 34 years old, Ezra was quiet, efficient, and asked for very little in terms of payment. He seemed like the perfect solution to David's need for extra hands during the brutal season ahead. By November, Ezra had become a fixture at the Watson farm. He slept in the barn, took his meals with the family, and worked from dawn until dusk without complaint. Rose mentioned to a neighbor that Ezra was peculiar but harmless, always watching, always listening, but never causing trouble. The children were instructed to be polite but keep their distance. Then, on the morning of December 17, 1879, something happened that would transform this simple farming family into one of the most disturbing mysteries in Virginia history. A neighbor, Samuel Porter, rode to the Watson farm to return a borrowed tool. What he found there would haunt him until his dying day. The house was silent. Too silent. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the freezing temperature. The barn door hung open, swinging slowly in the winter wind. The livestock appeared neglected, almost frantic with hunger and thirst. Samuel called out. No one answered. He dismounted and approached the house, his breath forming clouds in the cold December air. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the scene was both ordinary and deeply wrong. The table was set for a meal, but no one was present. A pot sat on the cold stove. The children's toys lay scattered on the floor as if they had been playing moments before. Coats still hung by the door, boots lined up neatly beneath them. David Watson, Rose Watson, and their 3 children had vanished without a trace. But Ezra Coulter remained. Samuel found him in the barn, calmly tending to the animals as if nothing was amiss. When questioned about the family's whereabouts, Ezra's answer was simple and chilling. "They left," he said, "early this morning. Didn't say where they were going. Asked me to mind the farm until they returned." But something was wrong with this explanation. Something that Samuel Porter noticed immediately, something that made his blood run cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the December frost. From the kitchen window, he could see into the house, and hanging in the cold pantry, covered with cloth, were cuts of meat, fresh cuts, more meat than the Watsons had ever possessed, far more meat than any farm their size should have. To understand what happened at the Watson farm, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. 1879 was a time of profound isolation in the Appalachian regions of Virginia. The Civil War had ended only 14 years prior, leaving deep scars across the southern states. Grayson County, like much of rural Virginia, was still recovering from the devastation. Farms had been burned, families torn apart, and entire communities left to rebuild from ashes. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a place apart from the rest of America. Even before the war, these communities operated under their own rules, their own customs, their own understanding of right and wrong. Geographic isolation meant that help could be days or even weeks away during the winter months. When the snow fell deep, families were truly alone, dependent entirely on their own resources and the provisions they had stored for survival. According to census records from 1878, Grayson County had a population of just over 8,000 souls, scattered across hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain. The Watson farm sat approximately 12 miles from the nearest town, connected only by rough dirt roads that became impassable mud rivers in spring and frozen death traps in winter. David Watson had purchased the property in 1872, according to land records held in the county courthouse. He paid $400 for 160 acres of partially cleared land with a modest two-story farmhouse and a barn. Tax records show he had been slowly improving the property, year by year, building it into a sustainable operation. A letter discovered decades later, written by Rose Watson to her sister in Tennessee, dated September 1879, provides a rare glimpse into the family's life just months before their disappearance. The letter, now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, reads in part, "Dearest Catherine, the harvest has been good this year, praise the Lord. David says we shall have enough to see us through the winter, with plenty to spare. The children are growing so fast I can barely keep them in clothes. Little Emma asked about you yesterday, wondering when her favorite aunt might visit again. I told her perhaps in the spring, when the roads are passable. We have taken on a hired man for the winter months. His name is Ezra, and though he's a quiet sort, David says he works harder than any 3 men. I confess, he makes me uneasy with his staring, but David insists I am being foolish. A woman's intuition, I suppose. I pray I am wrong." Rose Watson's intuition, as it turned out, was devastatingly correct. The community surrounding the Watson farm was typical of Appalachian settlements of the era. Families lived miles apart, coming together only for church services, barn raisings, or emergency situations. Self-reliance was not just a virtue, but a necessity. Neighbors helped neighbors when they could, but everyone understood that survival ultimately depended on one's own preparations and fortitude. The winters in this region were legendary for their brutality. Historical weather records from the National Weather Service, compiled from various sources including farmers' almanacs and personal journals, indicate that the winter of 1879 to 1880 was particularly severe. Snow began falling in early November and continued intermittently through March. Temperatures regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Livestock froze in their pens. Wells froze solid. Families sometimes went weeks without seeing another living soul outside their immediate household. It was in this context of extreme isolation that Ezra Coulter entered the Watson family's life. Very little is known about Ezra's background before he arrived in Grayson County. No birth records have ever been found, no family connections established. He appears in the historical record like a ghost, materializing in October of 1879 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a peculiar intensity in his eyes that several townspeople later recalled. The owner of the general store in Independence, the nearest town, remembered Ezra coming in to purchase basic supplies in late October. The storekeeper, whose testimony was recorded by local authorities, described Ezra as a man of few words, pale complexion, with hands that were too soft for a farmhand. He asked about work, and I directed him to several farms that might need help. He thanked me and left. There was something about him that stayed with you, though I could not say exactly what. Another resident, a blacksmith named John Hutchins, recalled seeing Ezra at the church social in early November. He stood in the corner, watching everyone, never smiled, never joined in conversation, just watched. My wife remarked that he seemed to be studying people like a naturalist might study insects. Looking back now, knowing what we know, it sends shivers down my spine. But David Watson saw only a solution to his labor shortage. According to surviving correspondence between David and a fellow farmer, David wrote, "I have secured good help for the winter, a man named Coulter who asks for little and delivers much. Rose has her concerns, but I believe she worries overmuch. The man is simply reserved, as many who wander are. He will be a blessing during the difficult months ahead." The Watson children at the time of Ezra's arrival were aged 10, 8, and 5. Their names were Emma, Thomas, and little Margaret, called Maggie by the family. School records show they attended the one-room schoolhouse 3 miles from their farm, though attendance was sporadic during planting and harvest seasons, as was common for farming families. A teacher at the school, Miss Eleanor Pritchard, later provided testimony that has been preserved in county records. She stated, "The Watson children were bright, polite, and well cared for. Emma, the eldest, had a particular talent for reading and often helped the younger children with their lessons." They spoke of the new farmhand once, in early November. Young Thomas said the man made the animals nervous. The horses would shy away from him, and the dog refused to enter the barn when Ezra was inside. Children often have fanciful notions, but in light of what happened, I wonder if even the beasts sensed something unnatural. The broader context of Appalachian folklore cannot be ignored when examining this case. The mountain communities of Virginia, isolated for generations, had developed their own mythology, their own understanding of darkness, tales of witches, of creatures in the woods, of old ways that predated Christianity were still whispered in the hollows and valleys. While most of these stories can be dismissed as superstition, they provide insight into the psychological landscape of these communities. One particular legend, documented by folklorists in the early 20th century, spoke of the hunger that walks like a man, a spirit said to possess those who became too isolated, too desperate during the brutal mountain winters. According to these tales, the spirit would drive men to unspeakable acts, turning them into something no longer human. Whether Ezra Coulter had heard these tales, whether they influenced his actions, or whether he became a living embodiment of the very evil the stories warned against, remains one of the many mysteries surrounding this case. By December of 1879, the stage was set for horror. A family isolated by geography and weather, a stranger living among them, and winter closing in like a vice, cutting them off from any hope of help or escape. What happened next would shock even these hardened mountain communities, accustomed as they were to hardship and death. The morning of December 17th, 1879, began like any other winter day in the Appalachian Mountains. The sun rose late over frost-covered fields, casting long shadows through the bare trees surrounding the Watson farm. By all accounts, it should have been an ordinary day, but something had already gone terribly wrong inside that isolated farmhouse, something that would not be discovered until Samuel Porter arrived seeking to return a borrowed axe. Porter's testimony, recorded by the local sheriff 2 days after the incident, provides our most detailed account of the initial discovery. The document, written in careful script and preserved in the Grayson County archives, states, "I, Arrived at the Watson property approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. I noticed immediately that no smoke rose from the chimney, which struck me as odd given the temperature was well below freezing. The livestock in the pen appeared distressed, crying out for food and water. I called for David several times but received no answer. The front door was unlocked, which was not unusual for the Watsons, as they feared no thieves in these parts. Upon entering, I found the house in a state that can only be described as abandoned mid-activity. A child's doll lay on the floor near the hearth. Dishes sat on the table, though they were clean and empty. The stove was cold. Most disturbing was the absolute silence. In a house that had always been filled with the sounds of family life, I heard nothing but the wind against the windows. Porter continued through the house, calling out for the family, growing increasingly concerned with each empty room he discovered. The beds upstairs were made. Clothes hung in wardrobes. Personal items remained untouched. It was as if the family had simply evaporated, leaving everything behind, except themselves. It was when Porter returned downstairs and looked toward the back of the house that he noticed something that made his stomach turn. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see into the pantry where the family stored their provisions. Hanging from hooks on the ceiling were several large cuts of meat, wrapped partially in cloth. This in itself was not unusual. Most families butchered livestock in late autumn to provide meat through the winter months. But Porter knew the Watsons. He knew their livestock. They had owned 1 milk cow, a few chickens, and 2 pigs. He had seen those pigs alive just a week earlier when he had visited to discuss spring planting. The amount of meat hanging in that pantry far exceeded what those animals could have provided. When Porter finally located Ezra Coulter in the barn, the farmhand's demeanor was unnervingly calm. According to Porter's statement, he was pitching hay to the horses as if it were any ordinary morning. When I asked where the Watsons had gone, he looked at me with eyes that seemed empty of all human feeling. He said they had left early that morning before dawn, saying they needed to visit Rose's sick sister in Tennessee and asking him to mind the farm. But this made no sense. Rose's sister lived 3 days' journey by wagon. No family would undertake such a trip in mid-December without provisions, without their winter clothes, without telling their neighbors. Porter pressed Ezra for more details. When had they left exactly? What had they taken with them? Why had they not mentioned this trip to anyone previously? Ezra's answers were vague, contradictory. He claimed not to remember the exact time they departed. He said they had taken very little, planning to purchase what they needed along the way. He insisted he was merely following David's instructions. But Porter noticed something else, something he mentioned only briefly in his initial statement, but would elaborate on in later testimony. Ezra's clothes were clean, too clean. For a man who had supposedly been working on a farm for 2 months, his hands were smooth, his fingernails neat, and there was a smell coming from the house, faint but distinctive. It reminded Porter of the rendering facility in town where they processed animal carcasses. Porter left the farm and rode directly to Independence to inform the sheriff. Sheriff James Holloway, a veteran of the Civil War and a man not easily unsettled, took the report seriously enough to organize a search party the following day. The sheriff's official report, dated December 18, 1879, provides crucial details. Upon investigation of the Watson property, we found no signs of struggle or violence. However, several concerning elements emerged. First, the family's winter coats remained in the house, as did their boots. It is inconceivable that they would travel to Tennessee in December without proper winter clothing. Second, the wagon remained in the barn, along with both horses. How they would have traveled remains unexplained. Third, and most disturbing, we discovered in the root cellar beneath the house several items that defied immediate explanation. The sheriff's report becomes cryptic at this point, mentioning only evidence that has been secured for further examination. But a later addendum, written in different handwriting, presumably by a deputy, provides more detail. Found in the cellar were butchering tools that had been recently used and cleaned. Also discovered were several personal items belonging to the Watson family, including Rose Watson's wedding ring and David Watson's pocket watch. Why these valuable items would be left behind if the family had departed voluntarily remains a troubling question. Ezra Coulter maintained his story throughout initial and questioning. He seemed neither nervous nor defensive, answering questions in a flat, emotionless tone. He agreed to remain at the farm and continue caring for the property until the Watsons returned or were located. The sheriff, lacking any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, had no legal grounds to detain him. But as word of the disappearance spread through the community, neighbors began coming forward with their own observations and concerns. A woman named Martha Yates, who lived on an adjacent property, reported that she had seen smoke from the Watson chimney at unusual hours, sometimes in the middle of the night. She had also heard what she described as strange sounds coming from the direction of the farm, though she could not specify exactly what these sounds were. Another neighbor, Thomas Brennan, mentioned that his hunting dogs had refused to go near the Watson property for the past several weeks. Those dogs would track a bear through a blizzard, he stated, but they would not go within 100 yards of that farm. They would stop, whimper, and turn back. Animals know things we do not. Most troubling was a report from the local postmaster who revealed that Ezra had attempted to mail a letter 3 days before the disappearance. The letter had been addressed to someone in West Virginia, but the postmaster could not recall the exact name or location. He did remember, however, that the letter had been unusually thick and that Ezra had seemed anxious for it to be sent, immediately willing to pay extra for the fastest possible delivery. The contents of that letter have never been recovered. On December 20th, 3 days after the initial disappearance, Sheriff Holloway made a decision. He would conduct a thorough search of the Watson property, examining every building, every room, every possible hiding place. What they found would transform this missing persons case into something far darker. But before we continue with what the search party discovered, I want to pause and ask you a question. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe the Watsons truly left of their own accord? What do you make of Ezra Coulter's behavior? What could explain the extra meat in the pantry, the strange sounds in the night, the animals' fear? Share your theories with our community. Sometimes the darkest truths are the ones we hesitate to speak aloud, because what the investigators were about to uncover would confirm the worst fears of everyone involved and reveal a horror that would haunt Grayson County for generations to come. On the morning of December 20th, 1879, Sheriff Holloway returned to the Watson farm with 4 deputies and Dr. William Thorne, the county physician. They came prepared for a thorough investigation, bringing lanterns, tools for excavation, and a determination to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Ezra Coulter met them at the door with the same unsettling calm he had displayed since the disappearance. He offered no resistance to the search, merely stepping aside and saying, "Search wherever you wish. I have nothing to hide." His cooperation, rather than reassuring the men, only deepened their unease. The search began systematically, starting with the upper floors and working downward. They found nothing unusual in the bedrooms. The children's room still contained their toys and clothes. Rose and David's room showed no signs of disturbance. Everything appeared exactly as a family home should appear, frozen in time. It was in the kitchen that they began to notice details that had been overlooked during the initial discovery. Scratches on the wooden floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. A dark stain near the pantry door that had been scrubbed but not entirely removed, and when they examined the pantry more closely, The meat hanging from the hooks revealed itself to be far more troubling than initially assessed. Dr. Thorne, with his medical training, examined the cuts carefully. His report, written that same evening, states with clinical precision, "The tissue samples examined do not correspond to any common livestock. The muscle fiber structure, the bone fragments visible in certain cuts, and the overall composition suggest something other than pork or beef." Without laboratory analysis, which we do not possess the facilities to conduct, I cannot make a definitive determination. However, I must note my profound concern regarding the origin of this meat. The sheriff ordered all the meat to be removed and buried far from the property, but the worst was yet to come. The root cellar beneath the house was accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor. The space was perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and stone walls designed to keep vegetables and preserved foods cool through the summer and from freezing in winter. When Sheriff Holloway descended the ladder with his lantern held high, he expected to find the typical contents of such a space: barrels of apples, bins of potatoes, shelves lined with canned goods. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cellar had been transformed into something that resembled a butcher's workshop. Hooks had been installed along one wall. A wooden table sat in the center, its surface scarred with deep cuts and stained dark despite obvious attempts to clean it. Tools hung from nails driven into the walls, knives of various sizes, a bone saw, a cleaver, implements whose purposes were clear and horrifying. But it was what they found, buried in the dirt floor, that confirmed their worst fears. Sheriff Holloway's official report becomes sparse here, noting only human remains discovered, multiple individuals, investigation ongoing. But a letter written by one of the deputies to his brother, discovered decades later in a family estate, provides more detail. "We dug in that cellar for hours. What we found I cannot fully describe without losing my composure. Bones, so many bones. Small bones that could only belong to children. Larger bones from adults. They had been buried in shallow graves, covered with lime in an attempt to speed decomposition and mask the smell. Some of the remains showed evidence of having been processed, cut, separated. I have seen death in many forms, having served in the war, but nothing prepared me for this. 2 of our party became physically ill. The doctor identified remains from at least 5 individuals, though the condition of the evidence made exact counting impossible. The implications were inescapable and horrifying. The Watson family had not left their farm. They had never left. They had died there, in that house, at the hands of the man who now stood calmly upstairs, showing no emotion, no fear, no remorse. When confronted with the discovery, Ezra Coulter's response was chilling in its simplicity. He did not deny. He did not attempt to flee. He simply asked, "Have you found my journal?" The journal was discovered in Ezra's quarters in the barn, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat handwriting that detailed a descent into madness so profound that even hardened men found it difficult to read. The journal began innocuously enough. Early entries from October described Ezra's arrival at the farm, his appreciation for the work, and observations about the Watson family. But as November progressed, the entries became increasingly disturbing. One passage, dated November 8th, reads, "They trust me now. Rose leaves the children in my care while she tends to household duties. David shares his plans for the spring planting as if I will still be here. They have no idea what I see when I look at them. Not people, resources, survival made flesh." Another entry from November 23rd. "The hunger is becoming difficult to control. Not hunger of the body, but hunger of the spirit." The ancient texts speak of this, the transformation that comes when one fully embraces the truth of existence. We are all meat. Some of us simply acknowledge this reality while others hide from it behind false morality and weak Christian platitudes. The references to ancient texts appear repeatedly throughout the journal. Ezra wrote of teachings passed down through his family, practices that he claimed dated back centuries to the old countries of Europe, carried to America by immigrants who brought more than just their hopes and dreams. He spoke of rituals, of spiritual sustenance obtained through the consumption of human flesh, of achieving a higher state of being by breaking the ultimate taboo. Sheriff Holloway, attempting to understand the mind of the man they had apprehended, read through the entire journal. In a private letter to the state prosecutor, he wrote, "The man is clearly insane, but there is method in his madness. He believes himself to be following a religious or spiritual path, one that requires the sacrifice and consumption of others. Whether these beliefs are genuine or merely justification for base evil, I cannot determine. The result is the same." The most damning entries were those from December. Ezra had planned the murders meticulously. He wrote of studying the family's routines, of identifying the best time to act, of preparing the cellar in advance. On December 15th, just 2 days before the disappearance was reported, he wrote, "Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the snow falls to muffle any sounds, I will complete the work. David first, as he is the strongest, then Rose. The children last, as they will be too frightened to resist effectively. By the following morning, the transformation will be complete, and I will have achieved what few have dared to attempt." But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the journal was not the confession of murder, but what Ezra revealed about his past. He was not, as everyone had assumed, a simple drifter. He came from a family that had practiced these rituals for generations, hidden in the most remote corners of Appalachia, moving from place to place when suspicion grew too intense, always seeking new converts or new victims. The journal mentioned other farms, other families, spanning back years. Names and locations were listed, some struck through with a line, suggesting completion. The authorities would spend months attempting to verify these claims, traveling to remote areas, searching for evidence of other crimes. In several locations, they found abandoned properties with disturbing evidence in cellars and outbuildings, though the passage of time made it impossible to prove Ezra's involvement conclusively. One entry particularly troubled the investigators. Dated December 10th, it read, "I have sent word to the others. They will know what has been accomplished here and will continue the work in their own territories. The network remains strong, though we must always be cautious. The ignorant masses would destroy us if they knew the truth of what we are, what we have become. But we are patient, we are eternal, we are the hunger that never dies." This mention of others suggested that Ezra was not acting alone, that there might be a larger network of individuals engaged in similar activities. The sheriff immediately dispatched inquiries to law enforcement agencies across Virginia and neighboring states, warning of the possibility of additional perpetrators. Some responded with reports of their own unsolved disappearances in rural areas, cases where families had seemingly vanished without explanation. The investigation was expanding beyond a single horrific crime into something far more widespread and terrifying. Ezra Coulter was formally arrested on December 20th and held in the county jail to await trial. To everyone's surprise, he made no attempt to deny his crimes or mount any defense. In fact, he seemed eager to discuss what he had done, treating his interrogators to detailed descriptions that many found unbearable to hear. During a formal interview conducted on December 23rd, with a court stenographer present to record every word, Ezra provided a full confession. The transcript of this interview, preserved in the county courthouse, makes for deeply disturbing reading. When asked why he had killed the Watson family, Ezra responded, "Why does anyone eat? To sustain themselves, to survive, to thrive. The difference between Me and the comfortable citizens of this county is merely one of honesty. You all consume death. You simply prefer that someone else does the killing, that the meat comes to you cleaned and packaged, already transformed into something you can pretend was never alive. I acknowledge the reality of existence. We are predators. Some prey are simply more evolved than others. The prosecutor, attempting to understand the scope of Ezra's crimes, asked about the other names in the journal. Ezra smiled and said, "I have been traveling these mountains for 7 years. The Watson family was not the first, and if I had not been discovered, they would not have been the last. How many? Enough. Families in isolated locations, people who would not be missed quickly, who could disappear into the winter snow and leave nothing but questions behind." When pressed about the network he had mentioned in his journal, Ezra became evasive. "There are others who understand what I understand," he said. "But I will not give you their names. They will continue the work. This is merely one harvest of many." Dr. Thorne, who was present during parts of the interrogation, attempted to probe Ezra's psychological state. He asked whether Ezra felt any remorse for what he had done, any recognition that his actions were wrong. Ezra's response was chilling. Wrong. Who defines wrong? The weak create morality to protect themselves from the strong. I feel no remorse for being what I am, no more than a wolf feels remorse for killing a sheep. This is nature. This is truth. The doctor's subsequent report diagnosed Ezra with moral insanity, a term used in that era to describe individuals who seemed to lack any conscience or understanding of right and wrong. Modern psychology might classify him as a psychopath, someone fundamentally incapable of empathy or remorse. But labels ultimately meant little. The facts were clear. The crime was undeniable. The confession included details of the actual murders that were so graphic they were sealed by court order and not made public. Only the judge, the prosecutor, and the sheriff were permitted to read the complete account. Those who did read it reportedly suffered nightmares for months afterward. One detail that did emerge publicly was Ezra's claim that he had kept the family alive for several days after the initial attack, killing them one at a time, using their fear and suffering as part of his ritual. He also confirmed what the examination of the meat had suggested. He had consumed parts of the Watson family. He described this not with shame or horror, but with something approaching pride, as if he had accomplished something remarkable. He spoke of the spiritual transformation he experienced, of feeling the life force of his victims becoming part of himself. The community's reaction to these revelations was one of profound horror and rage. Crowds gathered outside the jail, demanding immediate execution. The sheriff had to post armed guards to prevent a lynching. There were calls for Ezra to be burned alive, to be tortured before death, to suffer as his victims had suffered. The civilized veneer of society was stripped away by the enormity of the crime, revealing the same capacity for violence that Ezra had embraced, simply directed against him. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Ezra's confession was his absolute certainty that he had done nothing wrong, his conviction that he represented an evolved form of humanity that had simply shed the unnecessary burden of morality. He showed no insanity in the traditional sense. He was lucid, articulate, and rational within the framework of his own twisted philosophy. This made him somehow more frightening than if he had been raving and incoherent. This was evil not as madness, but as choice. As investigators continued to search the Watson property and Ezra's belongings, they discovered elements that suggested his crimes were part of something even more disturbing than the acts of a lone killer. In the barn where Ezra had slept, beneath the floorboards where they had found the journal, they discovered additional items that pointed toward ritualistic practices. There were symbols carved into the wooden beams of the barn, strange configurations that resembled no known language or alphabet. A local professor of antiquities, brought in to examine them, identified elements that bore superficial similarity to ancient pagan markings from pre-Christian Europe, but noted that they appeared to be a corrupted or invented variation, rather than authentic historical symbols. "Someone has created their own mythology," the professor stated, "borrowing elements from various traditions and combining them into something new and malevolent." Also found were several candles made from animal fat, arranged in specific patterns, and a collection of bones that had been cleaned and carved with similar symbols. These appeared to be from various animals, but their arrangement suggested they had been used in some form of ceremony or ritual. Most disturbing were letters, not the letter Ezra had attempted to mail before the murders, which was never recovered, but correspondence he had received, hidden in a metal box buried outside the barn. These letters, from various individuals whose names were signed only with initials, suggested that the network Ezra had mentioned was indeed real. One letter, dated October 1879, just before Ezra, arrived at the Watson farm, read in part, "Brother, we received your message regarding the new territory. The family you have identified sounds suitable for the work. Proceed with caution as always. Remember that the ritual must be complete for the transformation to occur. Do not rush, do not become careless. We have lost too many of our kind to discovery. The hunger must be controlled, channeled, made sacred rather than profane." Another letter, from a different correspondent, discussed harvests in other locations and warned about increased law enforcement attention in certain areas. It mentioned specific counties in West Virginia and Kentucky where brothers and sisters were operating, though again using only initials or coded names that made identification impossible. The authorities attempted to trace these letters, examining postmarks and paper stock, but the investigation led nowhere. The postmarks came from small towns scattered across 3 states. When local sheriffs in those towns were contacted, they reported no unusual activity or disappearances, though several admitted that in the remote mountain areas of their jurisdictions, families sometimes did vanish without extensive investigation, particularly during harsh winters when communication was difficult. The implications were profoundly unsettling. If Ezra was telling the truth, if there truly was an organized network of individuals engaged in these practices, then the Watson family might represent only one case among many. How many other isolated farms held similar secrets? How many other missing families had met the same fate? Sheriff Holloway wrote to the Virginia State Police with his concerns, but the response he received was less than encouraging. The state simply lacked the resources to investigate every rural disappearance across the mountain regions. Unless concrete evidence emerged of additional crimes, there was little they could do beyond circulating Ezra's description and warning. Local authorities to be vigilant. The symbols found at the farm were photographed and distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region with instructions to report any similar markings. Over the following years, several reports did come in of similar symbols found in abandoned buildings or carved into trees in remote forests. Whether these were connected to Ezra's network or simply the work of copycat vandals remains unknown. One final discovery at the Watson farm deserves mention. In the cellar, carved into one of the stone walls in letters so small they were nearly invisible, was a message that investigators only noticed during their final sweep of the property. It read, "The first of winter, the meat of gods, the transformation eternal, E.C. December 16, 1879. December 16th was the day before the disappearance was reported, confirming the timeline of the murders, but the message itself, with its grandiose and cryptic language, provided a glimpse into how Ezra viewed his actions, not as crimes, but as religious observances, not as murder, but as sacred ritual. The investigation formally concluded in January of 1880 with Ezra in custody, facing multiple charges of murder. But for many involved, the questions raised by the case would never be fully answered. Was there truly a network of cannibalistic killers operating in the Appalachian Mountains? Or was Ezra simply a lone madman who had created an elaborate fantasy to justify his crimes? The evidence suggested both possibilities, and perhaps that ambiguity was the most terrifying aspect of all. The story of Ezra Coulter and the Watson family should have ended in 1880 with his execution. He was tried, convicted, and hanged on March 12th of that year, maintaining his composure and his convictions until the very end. His last words, recorded by witnesses, were, "The hunger never dies, it merely waits." The case was closed. The property was abandoned. The community tried to forget, but some stories refused to stay buried. In 1953, 73 years after the murders, a graduate student named Robert Fletcher from the University of Virginia arrived in Grayson County to conduct research for his thesis on post-Civil War rural communities. While examining property records in the county courthouse, he came across the file on the Watson case. Intrigued by the brief notations that mentioned unusual circumstances and sealed evidence, he petitioned the court to access the complete records. What Fletcher discovered consumed the next 3 years of his life. His thesis transformed into a book, The Hunger in the Hills, Cannibalism and Ritual Murder in Appalachia, published in 1956, but almost immediately suppressed due to pressure from local officials who feared it would damage the region's reputation. Only a handful of copies survive today, most held in university archives. In his research, Fletcher interviewed elderly residents who had been children when the murders occurred or who had heard stories from their parents and grandparents. These oral histories revealed details that had never made it into official records. An 87-year-old woman named Clara Booth, granddaughter of Samuel Porter, who had first discovered the empty Watson house, shared a story her grandfather had told her before his death in 1921. According to Clara, Samuel had never fully disclosed everything he saw that December morning. Grandfather said there were things in that house that the sheriff made him swear never to speak of, Clara told Fletcher. He said the meat in the pantry was only part of it. There were photographs. Ezra had taken photographs of the family, before and after. Grandfather said those photographs showed things that would drive a person mad to look upon. These photographs were never mentioned in any official report and have never been found. Whether they existed at all or were a product of trauma-induced false memory remains uncertain, but Clara insisted her grandfather was not a man given to exaggeration or lies. Another interview with a man named Thomas Whitley, who had been a deputy during the investigation, revealed additional information. By 1953, Whitley was 91 years old and in declining health, but his memories of the case remained sharp. He told Fletcher about the letters found in Ezra's possession, the ones suggesting a network of like-minded individuals. "We tried to trace them," Whitley said, "spent months on it. Found some strange things in West Virginia. An abandoned cabin with symbols on the walls like the ones Ezra had carved. A family that had gone missing in 1876, never found. But we could never prove a connection. The trail always went cold." Whitley also mentioned something that had never been included in official records. During the search of the Watson property, they had found a locked metal box buried near the barn. Inside were items that Whitley described as trophies, personal effects from multiple individuals, some of which matched the descriptions of people who had been reported missing from surrounding counties over the previous decade. "We tried to follow up," Whitley said, but most of the families had moved away or died. Without bodies, without proof, there was nothing we could do. We kept the items as evidence, but eventually they were destroyed in a tea or courthouse fire in 1907. The loss of this evidence in the fire has been a source of frustration for researchers ever since. Without the physical artifacts, it became impossible to verify Ezra's claims about his previous victims or the existence of his network. Fletcher's research led him to other locations mentioned in Ezra's journal. In a remote area of West Virginia, he located the ruins of a farmhouse that matched one of the addresses. Local records showed a family named Brenner had lived there until 1877, when they apparently abandoned the property overnight, leaving all their possessions behind. No missing persons report was ever filed because the family had been reclusive and without close ties to the community. Fletcher found symbols carved into trees near the property that matched those from the Watson farm. In Kentucky, Fletcher investigated another lead, a property where a family named Sutton had disappeared in 1878. The case had been classified as likely victims of bandits, but Fletcher discovered newspaper accounts that mentioned peculiar circumstances and disturbing evidence that was never fully explained. The property was now owned by a logging company, and any physical evidence had long since been destroyed by development. The most significant discovery came in 1957, when a local historian named Margaret Caldwell was organizing documents for the County Historical Society. Among a collection of papers donated by a family estate, she found a diary that had belonged to Eleanor Pritchard, the schoolteacher who had taught the Watson children. The diary had been damaged by water and mold, making parts illegible, but the sections that could be read provided haunting insights. Miss Pritchard had written extensively about the Watson family in the months before their disappearance. She described the children's growing anxiety about the new farmhand, their reluctance to be alone with him, and Rose Watson's increasing concern that something was wrong. One entry, dated November 30th, 1879, reads, "Rose Watson visited me today under the pretense of discussing Emma's education, but I could see the true purpose of her visit. She is frightened of the man her husband hired. She spoke in whispers, glancing toward the window as if afraid of being overheard even here, miles from her farm. She said Ezra watches them constantly, that she has found him standing outside the children's bedroom window at night, that the family dog disappeared a week ago, and she suspects he killed it." David refuses to hear her concerns, calling her overly emotional. Rose asked if the children could stay with me for a time, but I explained that I have no room and no authority to take them without their father's consent. I pray I was not wrong to send her back to that place. This diary entry, had it been known at the time, might have provided crucial evidence of premeditation and stalking. It also revealed that Rose Watson had attempted to protect her children, but had been constrained by the social structures of the time, which gave husbands absolute authority over family decisions. The diary continued through December, with Miss Pritchard noting the children's absence from school and her growing worry. The final entry, dated December 20th, 1879, the day of Ezra's arrest, simply states, "They are gone. All of them. My worst fears realized. May God forgive me for not doing more." Miss Pritchard never married and never taught again after that winter. She died in 1934, and her diary remained hidden in her family's possession for decades until it was donated to the Historical Society. In the 1970s, interest in the case was briefly renewed when a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a film about the Watson murders. During his research, he interviewed descendants of several families who had lived in the area. During the 1870s, Several elderly residents, speaking more freely in the anonymity of recorded interviews, shared stories that had been whispered about for generations. One man, whose great-uncle had been part of the original search party, claimed that more bodies had been found than were officially reported. "They found remains from at least 10 people," he stated, but the sheriff and the town leaders decided not to make it all public. They feared it would cause panic, maybe even violent retribution against other outsiders in the community, so they listed only the Watson family in the official records and buried the rest quietly. This claim has never been verified, and the documentary was never completed due to lack of funding and continued resistance from local authorities, who felt the story reflected poorly on the region. The most recent development in the case came in 1983, when construction workers preparing a site for a new road discovered human remains in a wooded area approximately 5 miles from the Watson farm. Forensic analysis determined the bones were from the late 19th century and belonged to at least 3 individuals, including one child. The bones showed evidence of having been deliberately buried and, disturbingly, showed cut marks consistent with butchering. The discovery prompted a brief police investigation, but with over a century having passed, there was little that could be done. The remains were eventually given a proper burial, and a small memorial marker was placed at the site, though it makes no mention of the suspected connection to Ezra Coulter. To this day, researchers occasionally visit Grayson County, searching through archives, interviewing descendants, trying to piece together a complete picture of what happened during that dark winter of 1879. The Watson farm property has changed hands several times over the decades. The original buildings were torn down in the 1930s, and a new house was built on the site in the 1960s. The current owners reportedly have no knowledge of the property's history, and most locals prefer to keep it that way. The question that haunts researchers is not what happened to the Watson family. That much is known. The question is how many other families met the same fate, and whether Ezra Coulter's network was real or merely the delusion of a madman trying to make his crimes seem more significant than the acts of one disturbed individual. The fragments of evidence that have emerged over the decades suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps there were a few others who shared Ezra's twisted beliefs. Perhaps some of the unsolved disappearances in those isolated mountain communities were connected to his crimes, but the scale of the network, if it existed, will likely never be known. What is certain is that the Watson family deserved better than they received. They offered shelter and work to a stranger and paid for their kindness with their lives. Their story stands as a dark reminder of the evil that can hide behind a calm exterior and the vulnerability of isolated communities to predators who understand how to exploit that isolation. So what truly happened in that isolated farmhouse during the winter of 1879? Despite over a century of investigation, documentation, and speculation, the complete truth remains elusive, hidden in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. Like so many secrets before it, the facts we know are these. The Watson family disappeared. Ezra Coulter confessed to their murders. Human remains were found. Justice, in its 19th century form, was carried out when Ezra was executed. But beyond these certainties lie questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The first theory, and perhaps the most comforting, is that Ezra Coulter was simply a lone madman, a psychopath who invented an elaborate mythology to justify his crimes and make himself feel important. According to this interpretation, the letters from other members of his supposed network were forgeries, written by Ezra himself to create the illusion of belonging to something larger. The symbols, The rituals, the talk of spiritual transformation were all the delusions of a sick mind, trying to make murder seem meaningful rather than merely monstrous. The other disappearances in the region were unrelated coincidences, tragic but separate events in an era when people vanished with disturbing frequency due to disease, accidents, banditry, and the harsh realities of frontier life. This theory has its proponents, particularly among those who find the alternative explanations too disturbing to accept. It allows us to believe that evil, when it manifests this extremely, is rare and isolated, an aberration rather than a pattern. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The second theory holds that Ezra was indeed part of a small network, perhaps a handful of individuals scattered across the Appalachian region who had developed similar beliefs and maintained contact through correspondence. This network was never as large or as organized as Ezra claimed, but it did exist. The similar symbols found at other locations, the pattern of disappearances in remote areas, the letters discovered in his possession, all point toward some level of coordination and shared ideology among a few deeply disturbed individuals. If this theory is correct, then Ezra's execution did not end the threat. Others in the network would have continued their activities, growing more cautious after his capture, moving more frequently, leaving fewer traces. Some of the unsolved disappearances in the decades that followed might have been their work. Eventually, through death or discovery, or perhaps even abandonment of their beliefs, the network would have dissolved, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and whispered stories. This theory is supported by the testimonies of investigators like Deputy Whitley, who spent months following leads that suggested connections between multiple cases. It is supported by the discovery of similar symbols at different locations separated by hundreds of miles. It is supported by the fact that the letters found in Ezra's possession appeared to be written by different hands, suggesting multiple correspondence. The third theory is the most disturbing and the one that historians and researchers debate most intensely. This theory suggests that what Ezra described was not entirely fabrication or small network, but rather the remnant of much older practices that had been carried to America by immigrants from Europe and adapted to the isolation of the Appalachian Mountains. According to this interpretation, there may have been a genuine tradition, passed down through certain families, of ritualistic practices that included cannibalism as a form of spiritual observance. Anthropological records do document similar practices in various cultures throughout history, though almost always in contexts very different from 19th century America. Some researchers have suggested that isolated communities, cut off from mainstream society for generations, might have preserved or developed beliefs and practices that would seem unthinkable to outsiders. The Appalachian region, with its extreme isolation and its population of immigrants from diverse European backgrounds, would have been a place where such traditions could potentially survive undetected. If this theory holds any truth, then Ezra was not an aberration or even part of a small criminal network, but rather a practitioner of something that had existed for much longer than anyone wants to acknowledge. His mistake was not in his beliefs or actions from this perspective, but in being caught, in breaking the silence that had protected such practices for generations. Most scholars reject this theory as overly speculative, built more on folklore and fear than on solid evidence, but it persists in certain circles, particularly among those who have spent years studying the darker corners of Appalachian history and have encountered stories and evidence that resist simpler explanations. The truth, if it can ever be known, likely contains elements of all three theories. Ezra was certainly mentally disturbed. He may have been in contact with a few like-minded individuals, and he may have been influenced by older traditions and beliefs that had been passed down in distorted forms through isolated communities. Untangling which elements are true and which are fantasy may be impossible at this remove from the events. What we do know is this: the Watson family died horribly. Other families may have died similarly, and to this day, in the mountains of Virginia and the surrounding regions, there are places where locals will not go. Properties that sit abandoned for no clear reason, stories that are whispered but never openly discussed. Whether these are merely the echoes of old fears or whether something darker lingers in those isolated hollows remains an open question. The Watson farm no longer exists as it did in 1879. The land has been built upon, the buildings replaced, the very soil turned and changed by more than a century of use. But the memory remains, preserved in court documents, in newspaper archives, in the oral traditions of families who have lived in the region for generations. And, sometimes, on winter nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the mountains, people still tell the story of the farmhand who cooked the entire household and wonder if he truly acted alone. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in those mountains during the dark winter of 1879. Perhaps no one ever will. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because the answers don't exist, but because the answers are too terrible to fully comprehend. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the darkest chapters of American history. If you found this story compelling, disturbing, or thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. We explore the forgotten horrors, the buried secrets, and the mysteries that history tried to erase. Your engagement keeps our haunted community alive. Tell us in the comments what you believe happened. Was Ezra a lone killer or part of something larger? Do you think there are other cases connected to his that have never been solved? Share your theories, your thoughts, and if you have knowledge of similar cases or local legends from your own region, we would love to hear them. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look exactly like ordinary people. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next investigation.